Good morning. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. I hope you were able to find something to be thankful for. And if you were not able to find something to be thankful for, then hopefully by the end of today, you will find something to be thankful for. Christmas, if you want to know, Christmas caroling is going to be next Sunday, I believe, and we're going to have pizza here at the church. The little kids are going to decorate some little Christmas cards, and then at 2 o'clock we're going to go over to Well Cove and do some Christmas caroling there, and then I believe one other place as well. So if you want to join in that would be totally awesome. It's just a great time to get to go and meet some of the people that Bill and I get to preach to every week over there. We've been getting bigger and bigger numbers over there every week, and I got to share this. Last week was, sometimes other people ask me, why in the world do you go and waste your time over there? To which I'm like, waste my time. Well, last week I was preaching out of the book of James chapter 2, and I was talking about the different kinds of faith, and I talked about the demonic faith because even they believe in God and they tremble. And I talked about an intellectual faith, which is a counterfeit faith, and then there's a true faith. And at the end of the service, though, a 89-year-old or somewhere up in there lady says, "You mean I've been having a counterfeit faith all these years?" And she stayed afterwards, and she wanted to know how she could have the true faith. And let me tell you what, it's worth it for that. So come join us. Come, sing with us, and just mingle with these people. They get to hear about you guys all the time. And so just come and let them see your faces. Let them see the body that we are, and just be an encouragement to them. So, but please, that's next week, and just come for a time of refreshing with them as well. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and we'll open in prayer here, and then we're going to look at the concluding section here of Esther, chapter 9 and chapter 10 this week. So, Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray that you would just put the distractions away, Lord, not only from the people here, but from myself. Lord, help me to focus on the passage that you have laid here before us this morning. And Lord, I just pray that your truth would come out, that we would hear your word for what it is, and not just simply pick something out of it and think it to be something other than what it is. And Lord, I pray that we would just understand the wonderful truth that is being taught here as we conclude our study in the book of Esther. So I ask that you would be with us here today, that you would open our ears, open our hearts and our eyes and our minds to your wisdom and your truth. For I ask this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, today the title of my sermon is God's Promise is Kept. And you got to go clear back to the promise at the very beginning of time to find out what promise is being kept. And you got to understand all that other history there. And so, we started a journey in the book of Esther some time back. A book where God is not recognized by the people. And there is not one single mention of him. We looked at a petty and foolish king who took all the young, beautiful virgins into his harem. And we've seen that he chose Esther, the young, beautiful Jewish girl, and crowned her king. Now, he didn't know that she was Jewish at the time, but that doesn't mean anything. We also saw that there was a Jewish man who refused to bow down to Haman, the second in command. So Haman schemed and he plotted to rid himself of the thorn in his flesh, his joy stealer. And that person is Mordecai. And he wasn't satisfied with simply getting rid of Mordecai. He wanted to rid the entire kingdom of the rest of his kind, all of the Jewish people. And we have to remember that he had much the temper the same as King Ahasuerus. So, against impossible odds, and through a set of amazing circumstances, God works through Esther to keep his word and accomplish his purpose. Mordecai, he's promoted to second in command, and we now have a Jewish queen and a Jewish prime minister in this pagan kingdom. And even though God is not mentioned anywhere in the story, we have seen his hand at work everywhere, in all of the circumstances. Yes, even the ugly ones that we're not to clean up, but to take them for what they are. Haman's final solution to his problem with Mordecai not showing him honor was to destroy the whole Jewish race from Ahasuerus' kingdom. And this morning we're going to see that instead of this happening, the Jews will be delivered as their enemies are destroyed, which gave rise to the annual feast of Purim. Now, to be honest, many people are uncomfortable with the details found in these last two chapters of the book of Esther. They're uncomfortable with the conflict and the number of those who lost their lives. And they have this idea that Esther became bloodthirsty, and because she asked for another day. And so they're just uncomfortable with it. So as we come to Esther chapter 9, the day of doom that Haman had set up has finally arrived. And this is what we're going to start reading here. Esther chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them." This is on the 13th day of the 12th month. So about 9 months have passed since chapter 8. When we saw that Mordecai had brought the scribes and the satraps and the governors, and he had the message, the edict written out and declared and sent to all the provinces that the Jews were able to defend themselves if an enemy came against them. So this is 9 months have passed since the day that Haman had chosen by casting lots to destroy the Jews, on which all the enemies of the Jews were hoping to do just that. You see, they were hoping to overthrow the Jews and to take their plunder and to gain the wealth themselves. But look, though, at what this verse indicates. It indicates that the opposite happened. Now, I'm going to ask you again, why did that happen? Was it just circumstance? No. By now you should know the answer is the providence of God. You see, God did away with the king's command. He did away... I got ahead of myself here. Okay. So the opposite happened. Okay. The edict that Haman made had become a law because it was sealed with the king's signet ring, and it was not able to be reversed. But last week we saw that Mordecai brought the scribes, and he had a new edict pinned, and when he drafted it, it contradicted Haman's edict, because they didn't have a problem with having a law that contradicted another law, but they couldn't revoke a law that was already set up. So Haman, or Mordecai's edict, defeated Haman's blow by blow, which gave the Jewish people the right to defend themselves. So we have to understand that God caused all of these events to happen. God did away with the king's command. He did away with the hatred of Haman and the hostility of the attackers, because he is being faithful to his word. He's keeping the promise that he made to his people. So for some time had passed. The Jews had some time to get prepared for this day, and finally this day had come. And we read in chapter 9, verse 2, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. So the first thing that I want you to remember is that the text was very clear. The edict is very clear that Mordecai had written. And the Bible is very clear, and the author was very, very clear on what he wrote in here. And what they wrote is that the Jews, they could gather together, but according to the edict that Mordecai had penned and sealed with the king's signet ring, they could only attack those who attacked them. This was not a free-for-all. Okay? So that's the first thing that we have to understand when we read this verse, is that there was a stipulation. And the second thing that we need to take note of here is the phrase that no one could withstand them because of the fear that fell upon them. Now, this is where some people find a problem, or have a problem with the account that we're going to read of today, because they think that the Jews were not attacked because the people were too afraid to do so. Now, did God ever use fear as a way of fighting and helping his people? The answer is yes. Many times in the Old Testament, when the enemy would be coming up against Israel, God placed fear in their hearts, in their lives, so that they would not come against them. But that is not what this is saying here. You have to understand that. Okay? And I like how Brenneman says it. He's with the New American Commentary. He says, quote, "No one could stand does not mean that the enemies failed to attack. However, they could not prevail against the Jews." End of quote. You see, there's a difference in the meaning there. We can read that verse, and we can read it like this and say the Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, which means they went there and they grabbed these people and they attacked them because they were too afraid to attack them. But that's not what the text teaches. That's not what it teaches. You see, here, God is not using fear. God is using all of the circumstances that we have seen in our study of Esther, and the change of power, and in all of this, you know, God is keeping a promise that was given to them in the book of Judges and Joshua. He's keeping a promise that their enemies would not be able to prevail against them. So what we find here is that the Jews, when we read this down here in a bit, they only attacked those who attacked them. You see, all the cities that had a Jewish population, they gathered together to combine their strength on this day of calamity. But look at what else happens. Verses 3 and 4. It says, "Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews, because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai became greater and greater." Now you might be wondering why the author of Esther writes this little tidbit of information, if you're like me. What I found was that by mentioning the unexpected help from the Persian government officials, the author was using a literary technique which emphasizes the unseen hand of God. He uses a literary technique that emphasizes the unseen hand of God. He doesn't mention God, but it's the technique that is used to show and to say, hey, there's something behind this. Why? Well, because God has an eternal redemptive plan, and Israel is crucial to that plan. Israel's crucial to that plan. So the leaders of the empire, they were afraid of Mordecai because in the months since he had been appointed to the position of royal advisor, he had increased in prominence and power, and so they helped the Jews. You remember last week it said that many of them became like the Jews. They started acting like the Jews. They sided with the Jews. And because of the fact that Mordecai is in the position that he's in, because God is using all of the circumstances that have happened in the book of Esther, these princes have sided. And then when verse 5 we read this, thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of a sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. Now, once again, this has to be read in light of Esther chapter 2. You see, the Jews did not have the right to strike out against their enemies unless the enemies attacked first. The Jews only had the right to gather together and defend themselves, and that's exactly what we find them doing here when it says that they struck their enemies with the sword and slaughter and destruction. They did what they pleased with those who hated them. You see, they didn't just get to do what they wanted. That's not what that means either. In fact, we're not told exactly what they did with these men, but we know that they did what they pleased. So those who attacked the Jews were those who sided with Haman. Who was Haman? Do you remember? An Agagite. A descendant of Agag, king of who? The Amalekites. And who are the Amalekites? Who are the Amalekites? The people who attacked God's people. Right? Right? So those who attacked the Jews, they sided with Haman and his evil plot to destroy the Jews, which made them enemies of God. So what we find here is that God has delivered them from the hands of their enemies. We've seen, if you know anything about the Bible and you spend time in the Bible, you know that God has delivered his people from the hand of their enemies time and time again before. And as we look at the events in this narrative, we see the hand and the power of God delivering his chosen people yet once again. Because God is being faithful to his word. And now the author, he gives us a report, a news flash of the events. Look at verse 6. It says, at the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Portha, Adelia, Riditha, Parmashtha, Arisia, Ardia, and Viaziatha. And if you can say those better than me, good. But who are they? They're the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. Now, we've already heard, we're going to hear that because of something that's significant. They did not lay their hands on the plunder. But in the capital, the Jews killed 500 men. Now, we can sit there and say, well, when it says men, that means women and children too, because the Bible does talk like that in other places. But here, they killed 500 men. And they killed the 10 sons of Haman. And the author's focus here is on two things. The 10 sons of Haman, and that the Jews did not take the goods. And it's not so much on the 500 men as it is on Haman's 10 sons. So why does the author focus on the 10 sons? Well, because in the Hebrew, these names are set apart. They're in a single column like a gallows. It's written in the form of a gallows. And the whole point is they were set aside for specific destruction because they were true enemies of God. And the Hebrew text singles them out, because they were a long-time enemy of the Jews. Not necessarily these 500 other men, but these 10 sons, they are part of that original enemy of God's people. And I love that about the Hebrew text, how it sets them apart. If you ever get a chance to go and to look at it, go and look at it. I've got a Jewish friend. Her name is Talia Kayev, man, she sends me all sorts of pictures and different things when I have questions. And obviously, you don't read theirs the same way they read left to right, or I mean right to left. We read the opposite way. But it is just fascinating to see that old writing and stuff. But that's why the author is focusing on the 10 sons. And why does he do that? Because it is used to stress an important factor of truth. So what the author was stressing the fact that since these men were put to death, it is a fulfillment of prophecy. What is that prophecy? Well, in Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." How about Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19, where it says, "Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out from Egypt, how he met you along the way and attacked among you all the stragglers at your rear when you were faint and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore it shall come about when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your surrounding enemies in the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You must not forget." God has not forgotten what happened to his people. And even though his people are in exile, even though they have been in exile for, hundreds of years, he has not forgotten his promise to them. And God has not forgotten the promise that he made clear at the very beginning of creation. 3,000 years ago, however long you want to do the math. But I can guarantee it's not 6 million years ago. He's not forgotten his promise. The promise that the woman's seed will overcome the seed of the serpent. So Haman has been killed, his 10 sons have been killed, and the name of Amalek is blotted out just as God has promised. So what are we to remember so far? God has made a promise to you, right? And he always fulfills his promises. It may not be on your timetable, it may not be in the way you want it to be answered, but he always fulfills his promise. He always gives us an answer. The author's second focus is the fact that the Jews did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now, what is the author's point? The author was showing that the Jews were not looking to become rich. They were not looking to benefit personally from their deliverance of those they killed in self-defense, but only sought to protect their lives. Now, there's speculation as to way back when Saul was told to go in and to wipe these people out and not let them live and not to take any plunder. But what did he do? He killed some of them, let some of them live, and he took some of the plunder. And so there's speculation as to the fact that they were trying to right that wrong here. They didn't want to make the same mistake. But I don't know that you can bridge that thought here. What we do know is that it says they didn't take it. And for whatever reason, the author didn't tell us. So what do we have here? Moving on, we get to hear some more. Starting in verse 11, it says, "On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa were reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, 'The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have you done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall even be granted to you. And what is your further request? It shall be done also.' Then Esther said, 'If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows.' So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. And the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend themselves and rid themselves of their enemies and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing." So here we have an interview between Ahasuerus and Esther. Ahasuerus, he's heard reports of the battle. He's heard reports of those that were taken. And what gets me is that he does not appear to be distressed over the news of 500 men and Haman's 10 sons being killed in the capital. And when he says, "What then have you done with the rest of your king's provinces?" It's almost like he's saying, "Hey, that's pretty impressive. What have you done elsewhere?" You know, it can come across that way. But so he hears this, and he asks, "What has been done in the other provinces, and what is your further request?" And so Esther asks for an extension to permit the Jews to do the same thing the edict allowed them to do on this day, again tomorrow. And she wanted to have Haman's dead sons hanged on the gallows. Now, the edict only allowed the Jews to defend themselves. So again, the next day, they're only going to get to defend themselves. Why hang Haman's sons? Well, it was the same reason that Haman wanted to hang Mordecai, was to distill fear into the people and say, this is what's going to happen if you come against God's people. So Haman's sons, they were hung on the gallows, and those who attacked the Jews the next day, 300 men, were killed. And once again, no one took any of the plunder or the spoils of those killed again. And when asking, why did Esther ask for another day, I love what Spurgeon says. Spurgeon says, quote, "Now it was God's intent that at last conflict should take place between Israel and Amalek. The conflict, which began with Joshua in the desert, was to be finished by Mordecai in the king's palace. End of quote. Why did Esther ask for a second day? Well, because God told her to do that. He was going to take care of the enemy once and for all. So we learn that the other Jews in the provinces gathered together and killed 75,000 men who attacked them. But throughout the whole kingdom, no one took anything from those they killed. And after all of this, the Feast of Purim is established. There is a celebration. Look at verse 18. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month Adar and of the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies. And it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme, which he had devised against the Jews, should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So here's what we have. This is set up. It's a day of rejoicing. You see, Mordecai, he writes everything down in a letter mandating that the day of victory be observed now as a holiday among the Jews. They named that day Purim, after the pur, the lots that Haman had cast to determine how and when to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jewish people. But it turned out to be a day of deliverance, because God reversed that. So each year, the Jews are to observe the Feast of Purim, and two things are to happen. First, the Jewish people were to remember, the providence of God. His intervention on their behalf, his deliverance, of delivering them from the hand of their enemy. And the second thing that was to happen was they were to remember to rejoice. They were to remember to rejoice. I mean, this day commemorated their victory, because the plot that was meant to destroy them became the festival that united them. And so, keeping that in mind, we have to look at our final section of Scripture here, starting in verse 28. It says, so these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days, Purim, were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and their descendants, with instructions for their times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, as it is written in the book. Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and his strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke of the welfare of his whole nation. See, he not only sought the good of his own people, he sought the good of the people who were in this empire around him as well. So Esther, we find, confirms Mordecai's decree, which shows that she has come fully into her royal legislative authority. She is acting like the queen that she has grown up to become. And then in chapter 10, our attention is focused on Mordecai. His high honor and privilege, his great popularity among the Jews. And unlike Haman, Mordecai sought the good of his people and spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. Now, understand this. Esther and Mordecai are still subjects to Ahasuerus. He is the real power in the empire. So the end of Esther is filled with a great victory and the joy of God's people. But the blessings of God do not stop here. They do not stop here. God is continuing to preserve this nation. And there's a reason. So in conclusion today, as we come to the end of our time in Esther, we are to remember the faithfulness of God. And that He kept His word. He kept His promise that He made to His people. So the question of why study the book of Esther? Well, the answer is here. We get to see God being faithful to His word. We get to see God preserving this Jewish nation so that the promised Messiah would come. Why study it? Because as we remember the story, as we remember the events, the circumstances, and how God worked in all of them, we can rest in the fact that this is the same God who loves us and gave His only Son to deliver us, sinners, from His enemy, and an eternity in hell. Why study Esther? Because it's through these people that God preserved, that He was so faithful to, that we have a promise that has been kept to us. You see, we are not to forget how faithful God is and of His gift to sinful mankind. In fact, we are to teach. We're to pass this truth on down to our children and to the younger generations, just as the Jews were to remember what has happened here in the book of Esther and pass it down. So what are you to do with the truths in the book of Esther? You are to remember grace, and you are to rejoice. I'm going to ask you to please stand with us and join us in singing this closing song, Nothing But the Blood